You stir a spoonful of sugar into your coffee without thinking twice. It dissolves in seconds. It costs almost nothing. For most of human history, that same white crystal was locked behind kings, medicine cabinets, and armed ships. How did something so cheap start out so precious that it once rivaled gold? The story does not begin in a factory. It begins in the swamps of New Guinea. Archaeobotanical research suggests that people there were cultivating sugarcane as early as 8000 BCE, chewing the raw stalks for their sweetness, long before anyone thought to extract the juice. That is 10,000 years of history sitting inside a plant most people today only picture as processed powder. From New Guinea, sugarcane slowly traveled west, carried by traders and migrating farmers into Southeast Asia, then into India. It was in India, sometime around the 4th century BCE, that people first learned to boil cane juice down into solid crystals. The historian Andrew Dalby, who's written extensively on the history of food and trade, notes that Sanskrit texts describe this crystallized sugar using the word sakkara, the linguistic root behind our modern word sugar itself. Language carried the memory of the process long after the process was forgotten. For centuries, sugar stayed almost entirely within Asia. The Roman world knew of it only as a rumor from the East. The naturalist, Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described a strange substance called saccharon, harvested from reeds in India and Arabia, used not as food but as medicine. That detail matters. Sugar's earliest reputation in the West was not as a sweetener at all. It was a drug, prescribed in tiny amounts to treat stomach ailments, sold by weight in apothecaries alongside cinnamon and pepper dot. So picture that world for a moment. Imagine standing inside a Baghdad pharmacy during the 9th century, at the height of the Islamic Golden Age. Physicians like Al-Razi, writing in this period, cataloged sugar among the remedies. Islamic engineers had already begun refining cane juice into purer, harder crystals, building some of the first dedicated sugar mills in Persia and along the Levant. This was not yet a food for the masses. It was a controlled substance produced through skilled labor, and it stayed that way as it crept slowly toward Europe. The Crusades became sugar's unlikely delivery system. European soldiers returning from the Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th and 13th centuries brought back tastes for foods they had never known, sugar chief among them. Venetian merchants, sitting at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, built fortunes importing it. By the 14th century, a small quantity of sugar could cost as much as a skilled laborer earned in weeks. It was locked in cabinets alongside jewelry. It was served at royal banquets not as flavor, but as spectacle, sculpted into elaborate sugar structures called subtleties, displayed at the tables of kings to announce their wealth before anyone even ate a bite. Here is the twist most people never expect. Sugar was never really about taste at first. It was about status. The wealthier you were, the more sugar you could afford to waste on show rather than nutrition. For centuries, sweetness itself was a symbol of power, not a household staple. Everything changed once sugarcane left Asia and the Mediterranean behind and crossed the Atlantic. Portuguese planters had already been experimenting with cane cultivation on the islands of Madeira and Snow, Tome off the African coast during the 15th century, testing a plantation model that relied heavily on enslaved labor. When cane reached the Caribbean after Columbus's voyages, that model followed with it, and it scaled up violently. Barbados became the turning point. Starting in the 1640s, English planters transformed the small island into what historians now call the Sugar Revolution. Land that had grown tobacco and cotton was converted almost entirely to cane, and the labor to run it came overwhelmingly from enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz, in his landmark study Sweetness and Power, traced exactly how this shift reordered the world economy. Sugar stopped being a luxury reserved for elites and became, through the machinery of slavery, cheap enough to reach ordinary tables in Europe for the first time in history. Let that sink in. The very affordability that makes sugar unremarkable to you today was built on one of the most brutal labor systems ever constructed. Millions of enslaved people were forced onto plantations across the Caribbean and Brazil, specifically to grow, harvest, and boil cane under conditions with staggeringly high mortality rates. The sugar in a cup of tea became, quite literally, a measure of how far that violence could be hidden behind a spoonful of sweetness. Mintz called this transformation the shift from sugar as a luxury good to sugar as a proletarian necessity, fueling the diets of factory workers during Europe's industrial age. And that fueling was not incidental. As Europe industrialized through the 18th and 19th centuries, sugar, alongside tea and coffee, became a cheap source of calories that let factory laborers work longer hours on smaller budgets. Sweetened tea breaks replaced more expensive meals. Sugar helped power the very industrial economy that then demanded more sugar to keep workers fed. It was a closed loop, and it was engineered. By the 19th century, sugar beets entered the picture, giving continental Europe a source of sugar that did not depend on tropical colonies at all. Napoleon, cut off from Caribbean sugar imports by a British naval blockade, pushed hard for domestic beet sugar production, and the industry that resulted eventually broke cane's near monopoly on the world's sweet tooth. The 20th century finished the transformation. Refining techniques grew faster and cheaper. Sugar moved from apothecary shelf to grocery aisle to nearly every processed food on the market, hidden in bread, sauces, and drinks where you might never expect it. What began as a rare medicinal import measured out in grains is now, according to data compiled by organizations like the World Health Organization, consumed by the average person in some countries at levels many times higher than recommended, often without the eater even realizing how much they have taken in, because so much of it is buried inside foods that do not taste like dessert at all. So here is the counterintuitive part. Sugar did not become common because people suddenly discovered they loved sweetness. Humans have always loved sweetness, going back to those first stalks chewed raw in New Guinea 10,000 years ago. What changed was not desire. What changed was supply, forced open first by trade routes, then by empire, then by slavery, then by industrial agriculture, until a substance once measured out like medicine became something poured freely into everything you eat. The next time you glance at a nutrition label and see sugar listed 3 or 4 times under different names: corn syrup, dextrose, sucrose, remember that every one of those names traces back to the same plant chewed by hand in a Pacific swamp. It traveled through Sanskrit texts, Baghdad pharmacies, Venetian trading houses, and Caribbean plantations to get to your kitchen. The sweetness has not changed. Only the cost of getting it to you has been rewritten, again and again, on the backs of people history rarely bothers to name. You stir that spoonful into your coffee, and it disappears in seconds. But it carries 10,000 years with it, and for most of that time, it was never as innocent as it looks now.